Ma'am, there's been a change. Your family moved your reservation to the roadside inn across town. They said it would be more appropriate for someone your age. That night, sitting in a dingy motel room with a broken air conditioner while my own family celebrated in luxury suites I had paid for, I made 6 phone calls that would expose a scheme 3 years in the making. Within 10 days, I owned every single hotel reservation they'd made for the entire wedding party. My daughter and son-in-law were facing fraud charges, and the family who thought a roadside motel was good enough for their 70-year-old matriarch learned why you should never underestimate someone who built a multi-million-dollar catering empire from nothing. Before we dive into this story, I need you to hit that like button and tell me in the comments, have you ever been dismissed or underestimated because of your age, only to prove them spectacularly wrong? Share your story below, because today you're going to learn that sometimes the people who think they can discard you like yesterday's trash are about to discover they just made the most expensive mistake of their lives. And if you love stories about entitled family members getting exactly what they deserve, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because this channel is all about turning your worst humiliations into your greatest victories. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. My name is Margaret Sinclair, and this story is about the Friday evening when I discovered that my own daughter, Jessica, and her husband, Robert, had spent 3 years systematically stealing my money while convincing our entire extended family that I was becoming senile and needed to be managed rather than respected. This is about how they used my granddaughter Caroline's wedding as the perfect opportunity to publicly humiliate me in front of 150 guests, while simultaneously funding their lavish lifestyle with money they'd embezzled from my business accounts. What they didn't understand was that the woman they'd relegated to a roadside motel had built Sinclair Catering from a single catering cart in 1975 into the premier event planning company in the Pacific Northwest, with annual revenues exceeding $8 million and a client list that included Fortune 500 companies, professional sports teams, and some of the most influential families in Oregon. They'd mistaken my generosity for weakness, my trust for stupidity, and my age for vulnerability. They were about to learn that 70 years of life experience had taught me exactly how to identify fraud, document theft, and destroy people who betrayed my trust. The business skills that had built my empire were about to be turned against the family members who thought they could steal from me without consequences. Caroline's wedding to James Mitchell had been planned for 18 months, with a guest list that read like a who's who of Portland's social and business elite. The ceremony was scheduled for Saturday evening at the historic Columbia River Gorge Hotel, followed by a reception that Jessica and Robert had insisted on planning to take the burden off my shoulders. The total cost was approaching $200,000, money that I'd agreed to contribute as my wedding gift to Caroline, believing I was helping to create the perfect celebration for my only granddaughter's special day. What I hadn't realized was that Jessica and Robert had been systematically inflating every expense, pocketing the difference, and using the wedding planning process as cover for their most ambitious theft yet. The floral arrangements I'd approved for $8,000 had actually cost $3,500. The photographer I'd supposedly hired for $5,000 was actually charging $2,800. The catering contract I'd signed for $45,000 was being fulfilled by my own company for $22,000. With Jessica and Robert keeping the $23,000 difference, but the hotel accommodations represented their most brazen theft. I'd authorized Jessica to book a block of rooms at the Four Seasons Portland for out-of-town guests, with presidential suites for immediate family members and standard luxury rooms for extended relatives and close friends. The total accommodation budget was $85,000 for the weekend. Money I'd transferred to Jessica's account 6 weeks before the wedding with explicit instructions about room assignments and guest comfort. What I discovered that Friday evening was that Jessica had actually booked the same accommodations for $31,000, had kept the $54,000 difference, and had planned to hide the theft by claiming that several guests had canceled at the last minute, requiring adjustments to the original arrangements. The roadside motel where I'd been relegated wasn't a last-minute accommodation change. It was a calculated humiliation designed to make me appear confused and unreliable in front of our most important family and social connections. The Four Seasons. Portland on Friday evening had been buzzing with the kind of elegant energy that accompanies high-profile social events. The lobby was filled with beautifully dressed guests checking in for Caroline's wedding weekend, and I'd felt proud and excited to be hosting such a memorable celebration for my granddaughter's special day. I'd approached the front desk with my confirmation email and credit card, expecting to be escorted to the suite Jessica had described as perfect for the mother of the bride. Instead, I'd been met with the kind of confused, slightly embarrassed expression that hotel staff wear when they're about to deliver bad news to a guest who clearly doesn't understand their situation. Mrs. Sinclair, the desk clerk had said, consulting his computer screen with obvious discomfort, "I'm showing that your reservation was modified this afternoon. Your daughter called to explain that there had been a change in your accommodation needs." The modification, he'd explained, had moved me from a luxury suite at the Four Seasons to a standard room at the Roadside Inn, a budget motel 15 miles, away in a part of town where most guests were long-haul truckers, traveling salespeople, and people whose credit cards had been declined at better establishments. Jessica had apparently told the hotel staff that I'd specifically requested simpler accommodations because the Four Seasons was too overwhelming for someone my age. "She seemed very concerned about your comfort level," the clerk had continued, his tone suggesting he believed he was being helpful. "She mentioned that you'd been having some difficulties with confusion lately, and that a quieter environment would be better for your mental state." Mental state. My own daughter had told the staff at Portland's most prestigious hotel that I was suffering from cognitive decline and needed to be treated like an invalid who couldn't handle sophisticated accommodations. In front of guests who knew me as a successful business owner, Jessica had positioned me as a woman whose family needed to make decisions for her because she was no longer competent to manage her own affairs. The drive to the Roadside Inn had been one of the most humiliating experiences of my 70 years of life. The contrast between the Four Seasons' elegant lobby and the motel's cracked parking lot filled with aging vehicles had been stark enough. But walking into the lobby and being greeted by the smell of stale cigarettes and industrial disinfectant had felt like being transported to a different universe entirely. The room itself had been clean but depressing. Industrial carpeting with mysterious stains, a television that required manual channel changing, a bathroom with water pressure that barely qualified as a trickle, and an air conditioning unit that made mechanical noises but produced no cool air. The view from my window was the motel's dumpster and a gas station, where people were conducting transactions that I preferred not to examine too closely. But the most devastating aspect of the situation hadn't been the physical discomfort. It had been the realization that while I was sitting in this roadside motel, my family was enjoying luxury accommodations that I had paid for, celebrating an event that I had funded, with people who believed I was too mentally incompetent to participate in normal family functions. Sitting on the motel room's uncomfortable bed, listening to the air conditioner's mechanical death rattle, I'd made the decision that would change everything. Instead of accepting this humiliation as an unfortunate misunderstanding, I was going to find out exactly what Jessica and Robert had been doing with my money and why they'd felt comfortable treating me like an inconvenience to be hidden away. The first phone call had been to my business manager, Patricia Wong, who'd been handling Sinclair Catering's financial operations for the past 12 years. Patricia was one of the most detail-oriented people I'd ever worked with, and she had access to all my business and personal accounts through our management agreement. "Margaret?" Patricia had said, her voice immediately concerned when I'd explained where I was calling from. "Something is definitely wrong. I've been reviewing the wedding expenses you authorized, and the numbers don't match what's actually been charged to your accounts." Patricia's preliminary investigation, conducted while I waited on the phone, had revealed discrepancies that went far beyond the hotel accommodations. The wedding expenses that Jessica had been reporting to me were consistently 40 to 60% higher than the actual charges appearing on my account statements. More disturbing, there were additional charges for services and vendors that I'd never approved, all authorized by someone using forged versions of my signature. "Margaret, this isn't just wedding expense inflation," Patricia had said, her voice taking on the serious tone she used when discussing major business problems. "Someone has been systematically diverting funds from your accounts for months, maybe years. The pattern suggests this has been going on much longer than just wedding planning." The second phone call had been to my attorney, Michael Chen, who specialized in business law and had been handling my legal affairs since 1998. Michael's practice focused on corporate fraud and fiduciary responsibility, and he'd dealt with enough family financial abuse cases to immediately understand the implications of what I was describing. "Margaret," Michael had said after I'd summarized the hotel situation and Patricia's preliminary findings, "what you're describing sounds like systematic financial elder abuse, possibly involving identity theft and fraud. If Jessica has been forging your signature on financial documents, we're looking at felony charges that could result in significant prison time." Michael had explained that family financial abuse cases often followed predictable patterns. Trusted relatives would gradually increase their access to elderly family members' finances, then begin redirecting funds for personal use while creating narratives about the victim's declining mental capacity to justify taking control of their assets. "The hotel incident isn't just cruel, it's strategic," Michael had continued. "By publicly positioning you as someone who needs family management of basic decisions, Jessica is creating a paper trail that could be used to support claims of your incompetence if you ever tried to challenge their financial control." The third phone call had been to my accountant, David Kim, who maintained detailed records of all my business and personal financial activities. David's analysis had been even more alarming than Patricia's initial findings. According to his records, Jessica had been accessing my accounts using what appeared to be legitimate authorization documents, but the signatures on these documents were sophisticated forgeries that had been created over an extended period. "Mrs. Sinclair," David had said, "I've identified at least 47 unauthorized transactions over the past 3 years, totaling approximately $340,000. The pattern suggests someone with detailed knowledge of your financial habits and account structures. This isn't random theft. It's systematic embezzlement by someone with intimate access to your personal information." The unauthorized transactions had included everything from luxury vacation charges to private school tuition payments for Caroline, credit card payments for Jessica and Robert's personal expenses, and even mortgage payments on a vacation property they'd purchased without my knowledge. All of these expenses had been cleverly disguised as legitimate business or family expenses, with forged authorization documents that would have been difficult to detect without detailed forensic analysis. The fourth phone call had been to Caroline herself, and this conversation had revealed the most heartbreaking aspect of Jessica and Robert's betrayal. Caroline had been told that I was developing early-stage dementia, that my behavior had become increasingly erratic and concerning, and that the family had been working together to protect me from making decisions that might be harmful to my health and financial security. "Grandma Maggie," Caroline had said, her voice filled with the kind of patient concern people use when speaking to someone they believe is mentally impaired. "Mom told me about your confusion episodes. We all just want to make sure you're safe and comfortable. The motel arrangement is just temporary until we can figure out better long-term care options for you." Care options. My own granddaughter believed that I needed to be placed in some kind of supervised living arrangement because I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. Jessica and Robert had spent months convincing our entire family that I was becoming a danger to myself, using fabricated stories about forgotten appointments, confused conversations, and financial mistakes that had actually been their own theft disguised as my incompetence. "Caroline," I'd said, keeping my voice calm and clear, "I need you to understand something very important. I am not suffering from dementia or any other cognitive impairment. I am 70 years old, not mentally incapacitated. The confusion and financial problems your mother has described are not symptoms of my declining health. They are evidence of fraud that your parents have been committing against me. The silence that had followed this statement had been profound. Caroline had clearly never considered the possibility that her parents might be lying about my mental state, and the suggestion that they might be stealing from me had been so far outside her understanding of family dynamics that she'd struggled to process what I was telling her. "But Grandma," Caroline had finally said, "Mom showed me the medical reports about your memory problems. Dr. Harrison said you were showing signs of early cognitive decline that could progress to more serious dementia symptoms." Dr. Harrison. Jessica had apparently forged medical documents as well, creating fictional diagnoses that would support her narrative about my declining mental capacity. The sophistication of this deception had been staggering. Not only had Jessica been stealing my money, but she'd been creating an elaborate medical and legal framework that would justify her control over my assets and decision-making. The fifth phone call had been to my longtime friend and business associate, Helen Rodriguez, who'd been invited to Caroline's wedding and was staying at the Four Seasons with the other honored guests. Helen's perspective had revealed another dimension of Jessica and Robert's strategy. They'd been systematically isolating me from my social and professional networks by spreading rumors about my declining mental health. "Margaret," Helen had said, her voice filled with concern and confusion, "Jessica told everyone at the rehearsal dinner tonight that you were having a difficult evening and needed to rest in a quiet environment. She said your doctor had recommended limiting social interactions until your medication adjustments started working better." Medication adjustments. Jessica had told our friends and family that I was being treated for cognitive decline with medications that were affecting my ability to participate in normal social activities. This explained why several people had seemed to be treating me differently over the past few months. They'd been told that I was struggling with mental health issues that required patient, careful handling. Helen had also revealed that Jessica and Robert had been hosting private dinners and social gatherings for our mutual friends, events where they'd discussed my deteriorating condition and their efforts to ensure my safety and comfort during this difficult transition. These conversations had served multiple purposes. They'd positioned Jessica and Robert as devoted caregivers dealing with a challenging family situation. They'd prepared our social circle to expect changes in my behavior and capabilities, and they'd created a support network that would validate their eventual decisions about my care and living arrangements. "Margaret, I have to ask," Helen had said. "How are you feeling? Jessica mentioned that you'd been having episodes of confusion and memory loss that were becoming more frequent and concerning. She said the family was working with specialists to develop a care plan that would keep you safe." Episodes of confusion, memory loss, care plan. Jessica had created an entire fictional medical narrative that explained every aspect of her increasing control over my life. Any resistance I might offer to their financial management would be dismissed as evidence of my cognitive decline. Any attempts to maintain my independence would be seen as dangerous denial of my deteriorating condition. The sixth and final phone call that night had been to my business partner and longtime friend, Thomas Mitchell, no relation to Caroline's fiancé, who served as co-president of Sinclair Catering and who'd been concerned about some recent changes in my business behavior and decision-making. "Margaret," Thomas had said, "I've been worried about you for weeks. Some of the financial decisions you've been making recently seemed uncharacteristic, and Jessica mentioned that you'd been having some health issues that might be affecting your judgment." The uncharacteristic financial decisions had actually been Jessica's unauthorized transactions, conducted using forged authorization documents that made it appear as though I was making increasingly poor business choices. Jessica had been gradually undermining my professional reputation by creating a pattern of financial mismanagement that could be attributed to my declining mental capacity. Thomas had explained that Jessica had contacted him several times over the past 6 months, expressing concern about my ability to continue managing the business effectively. She'd suggested that the family was considering options for transitioning some of my responsibilities to younger, more capable hands, and she'd asked about the possibility of selling my ownership stake in the company to ensure my financial security during my declining years. She seemed genuinely concerned about your well-being, Thomas had continued, and she mentioned that you'd been resistant to discussing these issues directly because you were having difficulty accepting the changes in your cognitive abilities. Resistant to discussing, difficulty accepting. Jessica had anticipated that I would resist their efforts to control my assets, and she'd preemptively explained this resistance as evidence of my denial about my mental decline. Any attempt I made to maintain control over my business or finances would be interpreted as proof that I was too impaired to make rational decisions about my own welfare. Sitting in that roadside motel room at 11:30 p.m. on Friday night, surrounded by the evidence of my daughter's 3-year campaign to steal my assets and destroy my reputation, I'd made the decision that would change everything. Jessica and Robert had underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. They'd assumed that age meant weakness, that trust meant stupidity, and that family loyalty would prevent me from fighting back when I discovered their betrayal. They were about to learn that the woman they'd relegated to a $39-a-night motel was someone who'd built a business empire through determination, intelligence, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The same skills that had transformed a single catering cart into an $8 million company were about to be focused on exposing their fraud, recovering my stolen assets, and ensuring they faced consequences proportional to their betrayal. The roadside motel where they'd expected me to spend the weekend in humiliated isolation was about to become the command center for a counterattack that would destroy their financial security, their social standing, and their freedom. The family who thought a cheap motel was good enough for their 70-year-old matriarch was about to discover that some people fight back harder than you ever expected. But what Jessica and Robert didn't understand was that their biggest mistake hadn't been stealing my money or humiliating me in front of our friends and family. Their biggest mistake had been underestimating exactly how much power I still had, exactly how many resources I could deploy when threatened, and exactly how devastating my response would be when someone tried to destroy everything I'd spent 7 decades building. The wedding weekend they'd planned as my final humiliation was about to become their complete destruction. And it all started with 6 phone calls from a roadside motel room where they'd expected me to quietly accept their version of my diminished reality. Sometimes the people who think they can discard you like yesterday's trash are about to discover they've awakened someone with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Jessica and Robert were about to get the most expensive education of their lives about what happens when you try to steal from someone who's spent 70 years learning exactly how to win. To understand how I reached that moment of complete betrayal, in a roadside motel room, you need to know about the empire I'd built before Jessica decided it belonged to her. A business born from necessity, forged through determination, and grown through the kind of relentless work ethic that Jessica had. Apparently mistaken for senility. Sinclair Catering had started in 1975 when I was 21 years old, recently divorced, and facing the reality of raising my 3-year-old daughter Jessica as a single mother with exactly $247 in my checking account and no marketable skills beyond a high school diploma, and an unfortunate talent for trusting people who didn't deserve it. My ex-husband, Richard Sinclair, had left us for his secretary 6 months after Jessica's birth, taking our savings, our car, and any illusions I'd had about depending on other people for my security. I'd been living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Southeast Portland, working as a waitress at Denny's for $2.30 an hour, plus tips that barely covered rent and basic groceries. Jessica spent her days at a discount daycare center that smelled like industrial disinfectant and featured caregivers who seemed more interested in their cigarette breaks than child development. Every night, I'd come home exhausted, pick up my daughter from daycare, and try to figure out how to create a better life for both of us, with resources that never seemed adequate for our basic needs. The inspiration for Sinclair. Catering had come from desperation rather than entrepreneurial vision. Mrs. Catherine Murphy, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment next to ours, had mentioned that her church was looking for someone to provide simple refreshments for their weekly Bible study meetings. They couldn't afford professional catering, but they were willing to pay $35 per week for coffee, sandwiches, and homemade cookies for 25 people. "Margaret," Mrs. Murphy had said, "you make the best chocolate chip cookies I've ever tasted. Why don't you talk to Pastor Williams about providing refreshments for our group? It's not much money, but it might help with your expenses." $35 per week represented nearly 20% of my monthly income, money that could mean the difference between paying the electric bill on time or choosing between electricity and groceries. But more importantly, it represented the possibility of doing something that I was genuinely good at, something that brought people joy instead of just fulfilling basic service requirements. I'd always loved cooking and baking, skills I'd learned from my grandmother who'd raised 6 children during the Depression by stretching every ingredient and making meals that were both economical and delicious. During my brief, unhappy marriage, cooking had been my refuge, the one area where I felt competent and creative while everything else in my life was controlled by a husband who treated me like an inconvenience he'd been unfortunate enough to marry. The meeting with Pastor Williams at Sacred Heart Community Church had been one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my young life. I'd dressed in my best outfit, a navy blue dress I'd worn to my wedding, and a pair of shoes that were developing holes in the soles, but still looked presentable from a distance. Jessica had stayed with Mrs. Murphy while I'd walked the 8 blocks to the church, carrying a plate of sample cookies and a handwritten proposal for weekly refreshment services. "Miss Sinclair," Pastor Williams had said, examining my cookies with the kind of careful attention that suggested he understood the importance of this opportunity to my financial survival. "These are exceptional. The women in our Bible study group are going to love these." The contract had been simple: coffee, sandwiches, and homemade baked goods for 25 people every Wednesday evening, delivered to the church by 6:30 p.m. and served from $7 to 9 p.m. I would provide all food, beverages, and serving supplies, and the church would pay me $35 per week, with payment made each Wednesday evening after the meeting concluded. The first week had been terrifying and exhilarating. I'd spent Tuesday evening shopping for ingredients with money I'd borrowed from Mrs. Murphy, staying up until 2 a.m. baking cookies and preparing sandwich ingredients, then rushing home from my Denny's shift on Wednesday to assemble everything, and walked to the church with Jessica in her stroller, pulling a borrowed wagon loaded with food and supplies. "These are wonderful," Mrs. Eleanor Richardson had said, approaching me after the Bible study meeting had concluded. "Did you make everything yourself?" Mrs. Richardson had been one of Portland's social elite, a woman whose husband owned Richardson Construction Company and whose opinion carried significant weight in the circles that mattered for business reputation. Her endorsement had led to my second client, Richardson Construction's monthly board meetings, which required refreshments for 12 people and paid $50 per month. The Richardson account had been followed by the Women's Auxiliary Club at the YIVE, Portland Art Museum, then the monthly book club meeting for the wives of doctors at Providence Medical Center, then the quarterly board meetings for Thompson and Associates architecture firm. Each new client had led to referrals, recommendations, and gradually increasing recognition that Margaret Sinclair could provide professional quality catering at prices that small organizations and businesses could afford. By the end of 1975, I'd been serving 8 regular clients and earning approximately $400 per month from catering, enough to quit my job at Denny's and focus entirely on building my business. Jessica had been enrolled in a better daycare center. We'd moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in a safer neighborhood, and for the first time since my divorce, I'd felt like I was building something meaningful rather than just surviving from paycheck to paycheck. The early years of Sinclair Catering had been characterized by constant learning, occasional disasters, and the gradual development of systems and skills that would eventually form the foundation of a sophisticated operation. I'd had no formal training in food service, business management, or customer relations. Everything I'd learned had come through experience, mistakes, and determination to provide service that exceeded my clients' expectations. The first major disaster had occurred during my 4th month of operation, when I'd accepted a contract to cater a retirement party for 50 people at First National Bank of Oregon. The event had required more food than I'd ever prepared, more complex logistics than I'd ever managed, and more professional presentation than my usual church basement and conference room venues had demanded. Everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. The borrowed van I'd used for transportation had broken down 3 blocks from the bank, forcing me to carry food containers on foot, while Jessica, now 4 years old, had helped by pulling our wagon loaded with supplies. The main dish, chicken salad sandwiches, had been over-seasoned to the point of being nearly inedible. The coffee had been weak and lukewarm because I'd underestimated the time required to brew large quantities. And the chocolate cake I'd planned, as the centerpiece dessert had collapsed during transport, leaving me with what looked like chocolate pudding served in cake pan fragments. "Miss Sinclair," the bank manager had said, his tone suggesting he was trying to be kind while delivering devastating criticism. "I think you might want to consider whether catering is really the right business for you. This level of service isn't what we expected." That night, sitting in our apartment with Jessica asleep in her bed and a $200 catering bill that I wouldn't be paid because the service had been unacceptable, I'd faced the choice that would define the rest of my life. I could accept that I wasn't capable of building a successful catering business, return to restaurant work or another service job, and abandon my dreams of independence and financial security. Or I could learn from my mistakes, develop better systems, and prove that I was capable of providing the professional service that clients expected. I'd chosen to fight. The next day, I'd visited every successful catering company in Portland, observing their operations, asking questions, and learning about equipment, logistics, and presentation standards that I'd never considered. I'd enrolled in a food safety certification course, a small business management workshop, and a professional cooking class that taught techniques for preparing large quantities of food efficiently and consistently. More importantly, I'd developed relationships with other women who were building service businesses, creating an informal network of mutual support and shared expertise that had provided both practical advice and emotional encouragement during the most challenging periods of business development. The transformation of Sinclair Catering from a struggling one-woman operation to a legitimate business had begun in 1977, when I'd received a call that would change everything. Helen Rodriguez, who managed events for the Portland Chamber of Commerce, had been recommended to me by Mrs. Richardson, and she'd been looking for a caterer who could provide elegant lunch service for the Chamber's monthly executive meetings. "Miss Sinclair," Helen had said, "Mrs. Richardson speaks very highly of your work, and we're looking for someone who can provide consistently excellent service for some of our most important business events. Are you interested in discussing a contract for monthly catering services?" The Chamber of Commerce contract had been worth $300 per month, but more importantly, it had provided exposure to Portland's business leadership and had established my reputation among people who had the authority to hire catering services for major corporate events. The executives who attended those monthly meetings had included bank presidents, real estate developers, manufacturing company owners, and professional service firm partners. Exactly the kind of decision-makers who could provide the referrals that would transform my small operation into a major business. The first chamber luncheon had been a complete success. I'd prepared herb-crusted salmon with lemon dill sauce, wild rice pilaf, seasonal vegetables, fresh rolls, and a selection of desserts that had prompted spontaneous applause from the attendees. More importantly, I'd provided service that was professional, efficient, and elegant enough to complement the Chamber's image as Portland's premier business organization. "Margaret," Helen had said after the event, "this was exceptional. I want to discuss expanding our arrangement to include our quarterly dinner meetings and our annual awards banquet. The expanded chamber contract had led to catering services for First Interstate Bank's board meetings, then corporate luncheons for Pacific Power and Light Company, then the annual holiday party for Powell's Books that had required service for 200 people and had established my reputation as someone who could handle large-scale events with professional expertise. By 1979, Sinclair Catering had been serving 37 regular clients, employing 4 part-time assistants, and generating annual revenue of approximately $85,000. I'd purchased professional equipment, established relationships with reliable suppliers, and developed systems for food preparation, presentation, and service that could be scaled to accommodate events ranging from intimate business meetings to elaborate social celebrations. The success of the late 1970s had required constant reinvestment in equipment, staff, and operational capacity. I'd rented commercial kitchen space in an industrial building on Southeast Division Street, purchased professional-grade ovens, refrigeration units, and food preparation equipment, and had hired experienced cooks and servers who could maintain quality standards during busy periods when I was managing multiple events simultaneously. The transition from working out of my apartment kitchen to operating a professional catering facility had been one of the most challenging aspects of business growth. Commercial food service involved health department regulations, licensing requirements, insurance considerations, and operational standards that were far more complex than anything I'd dealt with during my early years of small-scale catering. I'd spent months learning about food safety protocols, inventory management, staff scheduling, and cost accounting, skills that hadn't been necessary when I'd been preparing food for 25 people but were essential for operating a business that might serve 500 people on a single weekend. The learning curve had been steep and expensive, but it had also been necessary for establishing the foundation that would support future growth. The staff I'd hired during this period had included Maria Santos, an experienced cook who'd worked in restaurant kitchens for 15 years, and who'd taught me advanced food preparation techniques that had improved both quality and efficiency. Patricia Wong had joined as my bookkeeper and administrative assistant, bringing accounting skills and organizational abilities that had allowed me to focus on client relations and business development rather than getting overwhelmed by paperwork and financial management. Thomas Mitchell had been hired as an event coordinator in 1981, bringing experience from his previous work with hotel catering operations and providing the expertise needed to manage complex events that required coordination between multiple vendors, venues, and client requirements. Thomas had quickly proven himself to be not just an employee, but a strategic partner who understood both the operational and business development aspects of growing a catering company. The event that had transformed Sinclair Catering from a successful local business to a major player in the Pacific Northwest catering industry had been the 1982 Portland International Film Festival's opening night gala. The festival organizers had been looking for a caterer who could provide elegant dinner service for 400 guests, including film industry executives, local political leaders, and major donors who expected service that would reflect the event's importance and sophistication. "Margaret," the festival director had said during our initial meeting, "we need someone who can provide world-class service for people who are accustomed to the best restaurants and hotels in major cities. This event will be covered by regional media, and the catering needs to be impressive enough to enhance Portland's reputation as a cultural destination." The contract had been worth $25,000, more than I'd ever earned from a single event, but it had also required a level of menu sophistication, presentation elegance, and service coordination that had pushed every aspect of my operation to its limits. I'd spent weeks developing menu options, coordinating with the venue staff, and preparing my team for an event that would either establish our reputation at the highest level of the industry or expose our limitations in front of Portland's most influential people. The gala had been a spectacular success. The menu had featured Pacific Northwest salmon prepared with locally sourced ingredients, Oregon wine pairings, and desserts that had showcased regional specialties in presentations. that had been both elegant and distinctively Northwestern. The service had been flawless, the presentation had been magazine-worthy, and the client satisfaction had been overwhelming. "Margaret," the festival director had said after the event, "this was absolutely perfect. You've created something that rivals the best catering I've experienced in San Francisco or Seattle. We want to discuss having Sinclair Catering handle all our major events going forward." The film festival success had led to catering contracts for the Portland Opera's fundraising galas, the Oregon Symphony's donor events, the Portland Art Museum's exhibition openings, and corporate celebrations for companies like Nike, Intel, and Columbia Sportswear that had required service sophisticated enough to impress executives, clients, and media representatives from around the world. By 1985, Sinclair Catering had become the premier catering company in Portland, with annual revenues exceeding $2 million and a staff of 25 full-time employees. We'd catered events for 3 Oregon governors, numerous corporate headquarters, grand openings, and social celebrations for some of the Pacific Northwest's most prominent families. The business had grown far beyond simple food service to become a comprehensive event planning company that could coordinate everything from intimate business dinners to elaborate wedding celebrations involving hundreds of guests. Our services had included menu development, venue coordination, floral arrangements, entertainment booking, and complete event management that allowed clients to focus on enjoying their celebrations rather than worrying about logistics. The reputation I'd built had been based on 3 fundamental principles that had guided every aspect of our operation. Exceptional food quality that showcased Pacific Northwest ingredients and culinary traditions, flawless service that anticipated client needs and exceeded expectations, and creative presentation that made every event memorable and distinctive. These principles had been developed through years of experience, learning from both successes and failures, and constantly pushing ourselves to improve every aspect of our operation. The attention to detail that had characterized Sinclair Catering had become legendary among Portland's social and business elite, and our waiting list for major events had sometimes extended 6 months in advance. Throughout this period of explosive business growth, Jessica had been an integral part of my life and work. From the age of 3, when she'd helped me pull wagons full of catering supplies to church basement meetings, she'd grown up understanding that success required hard work, attention to detail, and unwavering commitment to excellence. By the time she was 10 years old, Jessica had been helping with simple food preparation tasks, learning to fold napkins for elegant presentations, and observing the client interaction skills that had made Sinclair Catering successful. "Mom," Jessica had said during one particularly busy weekend when she was 12, "I love watching you work with clients. You always know exactly what to say to make them feel special and confident about their events." I'd been proud of Jessica's interest in the business and had deliberately included her in age-appropriate aspects of operations, believing that she was learning valuable lessons about entrepreneurship, customer service, and the satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful through your own efforts. Jessica had seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the catering industry, often expressing interest in eventually joining the business full-time after completing her education. During her high school years, Jessica had worked part-time for Sinclair Catering, starting with simple tasks like inventory organization and basic food preparation, then gradually taking on more complex responsibilities like client communication and event coordination. She'd been naturally talented at the interpersonal aspects of the business, developing relationships with clients that complemented my focus on operational excellence and strategic planning. "Jessica has real potential in this industry," Thomas Mitchell had observed during Jessica's senior year of high school. "She understands both the business side and the creative side, and clients respond very positively to her personality and professional manner." I'd agreed with Thomas's assessment and had been excited about the possibility of eventually transitioning some business responsibilities to Jessica, creating a true family enterprise that could continue building on the foundation I'd established. The prospect of working alongside my daughter had seemed like the perfect culmination of everything I'd worked to achieve: professional success, financial security, and the opportunity to share my knowledge and experience with someone I loved. Jessica's college years at Oregon State University had been funded entirely by Sinclair Catering's profits, with additional support for her housing, transportation, and personal expenses that had reflected my belief that education was the best investment I could make in her future. Jessica had majored in business administration with a concentration in hospitality management, coursework that had been directly relevant to our family business and that had prepared her for increasingly sophisticated roles in event planning and client relations. "I'm learning so much that I can apply to Sinclair Catering," Jessica had said during one of our regular phone conversations while she'd been at OSU. "The professors are teaching us about customer relationship management, financial planning, and marketing strategies that could really help us grow the business even more." After graduation in 1998, Jessica had returned to Portland and had joined Sinclair Catering as an event coordinator, working alongside Thomas and gradually taking on more complex accounts and larger-scale events. Her performance had been excellent, her client relationships had been strong, and her contributions to business development had been significant enough that I'd begun planning for her eventual promotion to management positions that would prepare her for future ownership responsibilities. Jessica had met Robert Crawford in 2001, when he'd been working as a marketing coordinator for a Portland advertising agency that had hired Sinclair Catering for their annual client appreciation dinner. Robert had been 28 years old, charming and articulate, with an MBA from Portland State University, and apparent ambitions for advancing in the competitive world of corporate marketing. "Mom," Jessica had said after their third date, "Robert really understands business strategy and client relations. He's given me some interesting ideas about how we could expand Sinclair Catering's marketing efforts to reach new client segments." I'd been pleased that Jessica was dating someone who seemed to appreciate the business we'd built and who appeared to understand the professional challenges and opportunities in the service industry. Robert had been attentive to Jessica, respectful to me, and genuinely interested in learning about catering operations and event planning strategies. During their courtship, Robert had frequently attended Sinclair Catering events as Jessica's guest, observing our operations and asking thoughtful questions about business management, client development, and industry trends. His questions had seemed motivated by genuine curiosity and professional interest rather than casual social conversation. "Robert has some really insightful perspectives on customer service and brand development," Thomas had observed after Robert had attended several of our larger events. "He seems to understand the business aspects of what we do, not just the social aspects." Jessica and Robert had married in 2003, in a ceremony that had been both personally meaningful and professionally impressive. A demonstration of Sinclair Catering's capabilities that had been attended by many of our most important clients and had generated significant positive attention for our event planning services. The wedding had cost approximately $75,000, money I'd been happy to invest in Jessica's happiness and in showcasing our company's abilities. After their marriage, Robert had continued working in marketing while Jessica had advanced to a senior management position at Sinclair Catering. Their combined income had been substantial, their lifestyle had been comfortable, and their relationship had seemed stable and supportive. I'd been pleased that Jessica had found a partner who understood the demands of the hospitality industry and who seemed genuinely interested in supporting her career development. When Caroline had been born in 2005, I'd been overjoyed to become a grandmother and had looked forward to the possibility of eventually sharing the business with multiple generations of family members. Caroline had been a beautiful, intelligent child who'd brought immense joy to our family and who'd represented the continuation of everything I'd worked to build. The changes in Jessica and Robert's behavior had been so gradual that I hadn't initially recognized them as warning signs of future betrayal. Beginning around 2010, they'd started asking more detailed questions about Sinclair Catering's financial operations, client contracts, and business valuation, questions that had seemed motivated by legitimate interest in understanding the family business rather than planning to exploit it. "Mom," Jessica had said during one of our regular business planning meetings, "Robert and I have been talking about long-term financial planning, and we'd like to understand more about how the business assets are structured and what your plans are for eventual succession." The questions had seemed reasonable and responsible, exactly the kind of forward-thinking discussion that successful family businesses needed to have about continuity planning and asset management. I'd been pleased that Jessica and Robert were taking a mature approach to understanding their potential future roles in the company and their responsibilities for maintaining its success. Over the following months, Jessica had gradually requested access to more detailed financial information, business contracts, and operational data, explaining that she wanted to understand every aspect of the company in preparation for taking on greater management responsibilities. I'd been happy to share this information, believing that transparency and education were essential for preparing Jessica to eventually assume leadership of the business. "I want to make sure I understand all the legal and financial aspects of the business," Jessica had explained when she'd asked for copies of our banking agreements, insurance policies, and vendor contracts. "If I'm going to be responsible for managing these relationships eventually, I need to understand how everything works." Robert had also begun attending more business meetings and financial planning sessions, contributing insights about marketing strategies, client development, and operational efficiency that had seemed valuable and professional. His involvement had appeared to be supportive of Jessica's career development, rather than an attempt to gain control over business operations. "Robert has some interesting ideas about expanding our corporate catering services," I'd mentioned to Thomas during one of our management meetings. "He understands the decision-making processes in larger companies, and he thinks we could develop new revenue streams by targeting different types of business events." Thomas had agreed that Robert's suggestions had merit, and we'd implemented several of his recommendations for improving our marketing materials and client outreach strategies. The changes had resulted in increased business from corporate clients and had seemed to validate Robert's understanding of our industry and target markets. By 2015, Jessica had been promoted to Vice President of Operations, with comprehensive responsibility for client relations, event planning, and day-to-day business management. The promotion had included authorization to sign contracts, approve expenses, and make financial decisions within specified limits. Authority that had been necessary for efficient operations, but that had also provided access to company resources that could be misused by someone with fraudulent intentions. "I'm so proud of how Jessica has grown into her leadership role," I'd told Patricia Wong during one of our quarterly financial reviews. "She's really become an essential part of the business operation, and clients respond very positively to her management style." Patricia had agreed that Jessica's performance had been excellent, and the financial results during Jessica's tenure as vice president had been consistently strong. Revenue had continued growing, client satisfaction had remained high, and operational efficiency had improved in several key areas. There had been no obvious signs that Jessica was misusing her authority or diverting company resources for personal benefit. Robert had also become more involved in business planning and financial management, attending board meetings and participating in strategic planning sessions that had previously been limited to myself, Thomas, and Patricia. His contributions had continued to seem valuable and professional, and his suggestions had often resulted in improved business performance. "Robert really understands the financial aspects of running a service business," Thomas had observed. "His recommendations about cost management and revenue optimization have been very helpful." During this period, I'd also begun including Jessica and Robert in discussions about my personal financial planning, estate planning, and retirement preparations. These conversations had seemed like responsible family planning, ensuring that they understood my assets, my long-term care preferences, and my expectations for the eventual transfer of business ownership. "Mom," Jessica had said during one of these planning sessions, Robert and I want to make sure we understand all aspects of your financial situation so we can help you make the best decisions about retirement and estate planning. We want to ensure your security and peace of mind. I'd appreciated their apparent concern for my welfare and had shared detailed information about my investment accounts, retirement savings, insurance policies, and business ownership structure. This transparency had seemed like appropriate family financial planning rather than providing information that would later be used to facilitate theft and fraud. Looking back from that roadside motel room, I could see warning signs that I'd missed or misinterpreted during the years when Jessica and Robert had been positioning themselves to steal from me. Their increasing interest in financial details had been accompanied by subtle changes in their lifestyle that should have raised questions about the sources of their funding. By 2018, Jessica and Robert had been living well beyond what their combined salaries should have supported. They'd purchased a luxury home in the Pearl District, had been taking expensive vacations to Europe and Asia, and had been sending Caroline to an exclusive private school that cost more than $20,000 per year in tuition and fees. When I'd asked about their ability to afford these expenses, they'd explained that Robert's marketing career had been very successful and that they'd been careful with their investments and savings. "We've been really disciplined about financial planning," Robert had said when I'd complimented them on their beautiful new home. "We've been maximizing our investment returns and taking advantage of some excellent opportunities in real estate and stock markets." Their explanations had seemed plausible, and I'd been proud that they were achieving financial success through their own efforts. I hadn't considered the possibility that their affluent lifestyle was being funded by money they'd been stealing from my accounts using forged authorization documents. There had also been changes in how Jessica and Robert had related to me personally, changes that I'd attributed to the natural evolution of family relationships as children mature and establish their own identities and priorities. They'd become less available for family gatherings, less interested in spending time together outside of business contexts, and less communicative about their personal lives and future plans. Jessica and Robert seemed so busy with their own lives. I'd mentioned to Thomas during one of our conversations about family dynamics. "I suppose that's natural when people reach their 40s and have their own responsibilities and interests." Thomas had agreed that family relationships naturally change over time, and neither of us had considered that Jessica and Robert's increasing distance might be related to guilt about their fraudulent activities or strategic preparation for isolating me from family support when their theft was eventually discovered. Most significantly, I'd failed to recognize that Jessica's requests for increasing authority over business operations and access to financial information had been motivated by criminal intent rather than professional development. Her questions about account structures, authorization procedures, and financial management systems had been reconnaissance for fraud rather than preparation for legitimate business responsibility. The business empire I'd built through 43 years of hard work had ironically become the foundation that made Jessica and Robert's theft possible. Sinclair Catering's success had generated substantial cash flow, maintained multiple business accounts, and involved complex financial transactions that could be manipulated by someone with authorized access and detailed knowledge of operational procedures. The trust-based family business structure that had been essential for operational efficiency had also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by family members with fraudulent intentions. Jessica's legitimate authority to approve expenses and sign contracts had provided cover for unauthorized transactions, and the family's access to financial information had enabled sophisticated forgery and identity theft. More fundamentally, my success had created wealth that was attractive to thieves, assets that could be stolen and converted to personal use, and financial complexity that could disguise fraud for extended periods. The very achievements that I'd been most proud of had become the targets for betrayal by the people I'd trusted most completely. Sitting in that motel room, understanding the full scope of how my life's work had been systematically stolen by my own daughter, I'd realized that Jessica and Robert had been planning this betrayal for years, using their positions in my business and family to position themselves for the ultimate theft. They'd studied my operations, documented my procedures, and prepared forged documents that would allow them to steal my assets while creating a legal and medical framework that would prevent me from fighting back. But what they hadn't anticipated was that the same intelligence, determination, and business expertise that had built Sinclair Catering would be turned against them when their theft was discovered. The woman they'd underestimated as a confused elderly victim was actually someone with the resources, connections, and strategic thinking ability to destroy their lives completely. The foundation they'd tried to steal was about to become the platform for their complete destruction. And it would all begin with a 70-year-old woman in a roadside motel who decided that some betrayals deserved consequences that would last a lifetime. Looking back from that roadside motel room where Jessica had relegated me like discarded furniture, I couldn't help but remember the golden period from 2015 to 2020, when our family relationship had seemed perfect, and our business partnership had reached heights I'd never imagined possible. These had been the years when I'd trusted Jessica and Robert completely, when I'd believed we were building something together that would last for generations, and when every success had felt like validation that family businesses really could combine love with prosperity. It was during this period that Jessica had truly come into her own as a business leader, demonstrating capabilities that had made me incredibly proud and had convinced me that Sinclair Catering's future was secure in her hands. Her promotion to Vice President of Operations in 2015 had been celebrated not just within our company, but throughout Portland's business community, where she'd been recognized as one of the rising stars in the hospitality industry. "Margaret," Thomas Mitchell had said during the celebration dinner we'd hosted for Jessica's promotion, "you should be incredibly proud of what Jessica has accomplished. She's developed into one of the most capable event planning executives I've ever worked with, and clients genuinely love working with her." The praise had been well-deserved. Jessica's client relationships had been exceptional, her operational management had been flawless, and her contributions to business development had resulted in our most profitable years ever. Annual revenue had grown from $6.2 million in 2015 to over $8.8 million by 2019, with profit margins that had exceeded industry standards and client satisfaction ratings that had made us the most sought-after catering company in the Pacific Northwest. What I'd interpreted as evidence of Jessica's growing maturity and business acumen had actually been the result of her systematic theft from company and personal accounts, money that had funded the improvements, equipment purchases, and marketing investments that had driven our exceptional growth. The success I'd been so proud of had been built on stolen funds, and the daughter I'd been celebrating had been using her position to rob me while accepting my praise for achievements that had been financed through fraud. But during those golden years, everything had seemed perfect. Jessica had appeared to be the ideal successor, intelligent, hardworking, creative, and completely committed to maintaining the standards and values that had made Sinclair Catering successful. Our working relationship had been harmonious and productive, with Jessica handling day-to-day operations while I'd focused on strategic planning, major client relationships, and the kind of high-level business development that had continued expanding. Our market presence. One of Jessica's most successful initiatives during this period had been the expansion of our wedding planning services, a market segment that had generated substantial revenue and had enhanced our reputation as a full-service event planning company. Jessica had argued convincingly that weddings represented an underexploited opportunity for Sinclair Catering, pointing out that affluent couples were willing to pay premium prices for comprehensive event planning that eliminated stress and ensured perfection. "Mom," Jessica had said during one of our strategic planning meetings in 2016, "I think we're missing a huge opportunity in the wedding market. We have all the capabilities needed to provide complete wedding planning services, and the profit margins are significantly higher than corporate catering. I'd like to develop a dedicated wedding planning division." The proposal had made perfect business sense. We'd already been catering weddings for years, but we'd been limiting our services to food and beverage provision rather than offering the comprehensive planning services that could command much higher fees. Jessica's market research had shown that Portland couples were increasingly seeking event planners who could coordinate every aspect of their celebrations, from venue selection to entertainment booking to floral arrangements. I'd been enthusiastic about Jessica's proposal and had authorized the investment needed to establish our wedding planning division. The startup costs had included hiring specialized staff, developing marketing materials, establishing relationships with vendors and venues, and purchasing the equipment and inventory needed to provide comprehensive event planning services. I think this could add $2 million annually to our revenue within 3 years, Jessica had projected, presenting detailed financial analyses that had supported her optimistic projections. The wedding market in Portland is growing rapidly, and there's definitely demand for high-end planning services. Jessica's projections had been conservative. The wedding planning division had exceeded every target she'd set, generating $1.8 million in revenue during its first year of operation, and attracting clients who'd been willing to pay $15,000 to $50,000 for complete wedding planning services. The success had been driven by Jessica's exceptional talent for understanding clients' visions and translating them into flawless celebrations that had exceeded expectations. Jessica has a gift for making brides feel completely confident about their weddings, one of our clients had written in a testimonial that we'd featured prominently in our marketing materials. She anticipated needs we didn't even know we had, and created a celebration that was more beautiful than anything we'd imagined. The wedding planning success had led to expansion into other social event planning services, anniversary celebrations, corporate galas, fundraising events, and private parties that had further diversified our revenue streams and had established Jessica as one of Portland's most sought-after event planners. By 2018, the social events division had been generating nearly 40% of our total revenue and had attracted clients from Seattle, San Francisco, and even Los Angeles, who'd been willing to pay premium fees for Jessica's expertise. What I hadn't understood at the time was that Jessica had been systematically inflating the costs of wedding planning services, creating fictional expenses that had allowed her to skim substantial amounts from client payments. The $50,000 wedding that had actually cost $31,000 to execute had provided $19,000 that Jessica had diverted to personal accounts, using forged vendor invoices and fabricated expense reports to conceal the theft. The exceptional growth and success of this period had attracted significant attention from Portland's business community and had resulted in recognition that had validated everything I'd worked to achieve over 4 decades. In 2017, Sinclair Catering had been named Business of the Year by the Portland Chamber of Commerce, an honor that had been particularly meaningful because it had recognized not just our financial success, but our contributions to the community and our reputation for integrity and excellence. Sinclair Catering represents the best of Portland's business community, the chamber president had said during the awards ceremony. They've built a company that combines exceptional service with genuine commitment to their clients and community. Margaret and Jessica Sinclair have created something that makes our entire city proud. The award ceremony had been attended by over 300 of Portland's business and political leaders, and the recognition had generated media coverage that had further enhanced our reputation and had attracted new clients from throughout the Pacific Northwest. I'd been asked to speak at the ceremony, and I'd used the opportunity to acknowledge Jessica's contributions and to express my confidence in our company's future under her leadership. Jessica has brought new energy and vision to Sinclair Catering, I'd said during my acceptance speech. She represents the next generation of leadership that will carry our company forward, while maintaining the values and standards that have made us successful. I'm incredibly proud of what we've accomplished together. The speech had received enthusiastic applause, and several attendees had approached me afterward to compliment Jessica's professionalism and to express their admiration for our family business model. The evening had felt like the pinnacle of everything I'd worked to achieve: professional recognition, family harmony, and confidence in a secure future for the company I'd built. Jessica had also received individual recognition during this period, being named to Portland Business Journal's 40 Under 40 list in 2018 and receiving the Rising Star Award from the Pacific Northwest Event Planning Association in 2019. These honors had been based on her contributions to business growth, her innovation in event planning services, and her leadership in industry professional development activities. Jessica Sinclair represents the future of the event planning industry, the Business Journal profile had stated. She's combined traditional hospitality values with innovative service delivery to create experiences that consistently exceed client expectations. Her leadership at Sinclair Catering has established new standards for excellence in Pacific Northwest event planning. Reading these accolades had filled me with pride and had reinforced my confidence that Jessica was not just a capable successor, but someone who would surpass my own achievements and would take Sinclair Catering to levels of success that I'd never imagined possible. The recognition had seemed like external validation of everything I'd believed about Jessica's character and capabilities. What I'd failed to recognize was that Jessica's business success had been built on stolen money, that her innovation had been financed through fraud, and that her professional recognition had been achieved using resources that she'd embezzled from my accounts. The awards and accolades had been real, but they'd been earned through criminal activity rather than legitimate business accomplishment. Beyond our professional collaboration, the period from 2015 to 2020 had also represented the peak of our personal relationship as mother and daughter. Jessica had seemed genuinely interested in spending time together, regularly scheduling dinners, shopping trips, and weekend activities that had made me feel valued and loved rather than simply tolerated as an aging parent. "Mom, I really enjoy our time together," Jessica had said during one of our regular Saturday lunch dates. "I feel like we're not just mother and daughter, but real friends who genuinely enjoy each other's company. I hope we can continue having this kind of relationship for many years to come." These conversations had meant everything to me, particularly during the adjustment period following my 68th birthday, when I'd been increasingly conscious of aging and had been concerned about maintaining meaningful relationships as I'd entered my 8th decade. Jessica's apparent desire to spend time together had made me feel that aging didn't have to mean isolation or irrelevance. We'd established regular traditions during this period, monthly shopping trips to downtown Portland where we'd browse boutiques and art galleries, quarterly weekend getaways to coastal resorts where we'd enjoyed spa treatments and fine dining, and annual vacation trips to destinations like Napa Valley, Santa Fe, and Vancouver that had combined relaxation with cultural experiences. "I love traveling with you," Jessica had said during our 2018 trip to Napa Valley, where we'd spent 4 days touring wineries and enjoying gourmet restaurants. "You're such great company, and you know so much about food and wine. These trips are some of my favorite times of the year." The trips had been expensive, typically costing $8,000 to $12,000 for a week-long vacation, but I'd been happy to pay for experiences that had strengthened our relationship and had provided opportunities for the kind of extended conversations that had been difficult to arrange during busy work periods. I'd viewed the travel expenses as investments in our family bond rather than mere entertainment costs. What I'd later discovered was that Jessica had been systematically inflating these travel expenses, booking accommodations and activities that had actually cost 30–40% less than what she'd reported to me, then pocketing the difference while I'd believed I was paying for luxury experiences. The $12,000 Napa Valley trip had actually cost $7,200, with Jessica keeping the $4,800 difference while maintaining the fiction that she was simply helping me plan and book expensive vacations. Jessica had also become increasingly involved in my personal life during this period, offering advice about healthcare decisions, social activities, and financial planning that had seemed motivated by genuine concern for my welfare. She'd accompanied me to medical appointments, had helped research investment opportunities, and had been actively involved in discussions about my estate planning and long-term care preferences. "Mom, I want to make sure you're making decisions that will protect your health and financial security as you get older," Jessica had said during one of our conversations about retirement planning. "Robert and I are here to help with whatever you need, and we want to ensure you have the best possible quality of life during your retirement years." This apparent concern had seemed like evidence of Jessica's maturity and her genuine love for me as her mother. I'd appreciated having someone I trusted to help navigate the complex decisions that came with aging, and I'd been grateful that Jessica had been willing to take time from her busy professional life to assist with personal matters that had sometimes felt overwhelming. But Jessica's involvement in my personal affairs had actually been strategic positioning that had allowed her to gain access to financial information, medical records, and legal documents that she'd later use to facilitate her fraud scheme. The caring daughter who'd been helping me plan for secure aging had actually been documenting my assets and vulnerabilities in preparation for systematic theft. During this golden period, my relationship with Robert had also deepened and strengthened in ways that had made me feel like I'd gained not just a son-in-law but a genuine friend and business colleague. Robert's involvement in Sinclair Catering had expanded gradually, with his marketing expertise becoming increasingly valuable for business development and strategic planning. "Margaret," Robert had said during one of our quarterly business review meetings, "I've been analyzing our client acquisition patterns, and I think there are some significant opportunities for growth in the corporate event market. I'd like to present some ideas for expanding our services to technology companies and healthcare organizations." Robert's market analysis had been sophisticated and insightful, identifying client segments that we'd been underserving and revenue opportunities that we'd been missing. His recommendations had led to successful marketing campaigns that had attracted major new clients including Intel, Nike, and Legacy Health System, accounts that had generated substantial revenue and had enhanced our reputation in the corporate market. "Robert really understands how to position our services for different types of clients," Thomas Mitchell had observed. "His marketing background gives him insights that have been incredibly valuable for business development." I'd been impressed by Robert's business acumen and had appreciated his willingness to contribute his expertise to our family company. His suggestions had consistently resulted in improved performance, and his professional manner had made him a valuable representative of Sinclair Catering in client meetings and industry events. Robert had also become personally attentive in ways that had made me feel valued and appreciated as a family member, rather than simply tolerated as Jessica's mother. He'd remembered important dates like my birthday and the anniversary of Sinclair Catering's founding, had brought thoughtful gifts from their travels, and had made genuine efforts to include me in their social activities and family celebrations. "Margaret, we'd love to have you join us for dinner next Saturday," Robert would say when they'd been planning social events. "We're having some friends over, and we'd really enjoy your company. You always add so much to our conversations." These invitations had meant a great deal to me, particularly as I'd been conscious of the tendency for older adults to become isolated from their adult children's social lives. Robert's apparent desire to include me had made me feel that I was still a welcome and valued part of their life, rather than an obligation to be managed or an inconvenience to be avoided. Robert had also been supportive during health scares and family challenges, providing practical assistance and emotional support that had seemed motivated by genuine care and affection. When I'd been hospitalized briefly in 2018 for pneumonia, Robert had visited daily, had coordinated with medical staff, and had helped manage business operations while I'd been recovering. "Don't worry about anything except getting better," Robert had said during one of his hospital visits. "Jessica and I have everything under control at the office, and Thomas is handling all the urgent client matters. Just focus on your recovery." This support had seemed like evidence of Robert's character and his commitment to our family relationships. I'd felt grateful to have a son-in-law who'd been willing to step up during difficult times and who'd treated me like a valued family member rather than just his wife's mother. But Robert's attentiveness had actually been part of a calculated strategy to gain my trust and access to my personal and financial information. The caring son-in-law who'd been helping during medical emergencies had been documenting my health status and medical information for use in creating fraudulent medical reports about my cognitive decline. During this golden period, my relationship with my granddaughter Caroline had also flourished in ways that had brought me immense joy and had made me optimistic about the future of our family connections. Caroline had grown from a child into a remarkable young woman who'd seemed to appreciate our family history and who'd expressed interest in eventually joining Sinclair Catering after completing her education. "Grandma Maggie," Caroline had said, during one of our regular weekend visits, "I love hearing stories about how you built the business. It's so inspiring to know that you created something so successful starting from nothing. I hope I can be as strong and determined as you are." These conversations had been among the most meaningful experiences of my later years. Opportunities to share my life experiences with someone who'd seemed genuinely interested in learning from my successes and failures. Caroline had been an engaged listener who'd asked thoughtful questions about business strategy, career development, and life lessons that had made me feel that my experiences had value and relevance for the next generation. Caroline had also been academically successful and personally responsible in ways that had made me proud and confident about her future prospects. She'd maintained a 3.8 GPA at her exclusive private school, had been active in student government and community service activities, and had demonstrated the kind of character and work ethic that suggested she would be successful in whatever career path she'd chosen. "Caroline is really developing into an exceptional young woman," I told Jessica during one of our conversations about family dynamics. "She's intelligent, responsible, and thoughtful. You and Robert should be very proud of what you've accomplished as parents." Jessica had agreed with my assessment, and we'd often discussed our hopes for Caroline's future and our excitement about the possibility of her eventually joining our family business. The prospect of 3 generations working together had seemed like the perfect culmination of everything I'd worked to achieve. I'd been actively involved in Caroline's education during this period, paying for academic tutoring, enrichment activities, and educational travel that had been designed to prepare her for success in college and beyond. The investment had totaled approximately $150,000 over 5 years, money that I'd considered well spent on ensuring Caroline's educational opportunities. "Grandma, thank you so much for everything you do for my education," Caroline had written in a thank you note after I'd funded her participation in a summer study program in Europe. "I know how fortunate I am to have these opportunities, and I promise to work hard to make you proud of what I accomplish." Caroline's gratitude had seemed genuine, and her academic performance had justified my investment in her educational development. She'd been accepted to several prestigious universities and had been planning to major in business administration with the eventual goal of joining Sinclair Catering as a third-generation family member. But what I'd later learned was that Caroline had been told throughout this period that I was developing cognitive decline and that my generous financial support was evidence of impaired judgment that required family intervention. Jessica and Robert had been using my investment in Caroline's education as proof of my supposed inability to make sound financial decisions. "Grandma Maggie has been making some concerning financial choices lately," Jessica had apparently told Caroline. "The expensive gifts and educational funding are symptoms of confusion about money management. We're worried that she's becoming vulnerable to making poor decisions that could affect her long-term security." Caroline's gratitude had been real, but she'd been told that my generosity was evidence of mental decline rather than affection and investment in her future. The caring grandmother who'd been supporting her education had been portrayed as a confused elderly woman whose spending patterns were becoming erratic and concerning. During this golden period, I'd also made substantial investments in expanding and modernizing Sinclair Catering's operations, investments that had been recommended by Jessica and Robert, and that had seemed strategically sound for ensuring our continued competitiveness and growth. The improvements had included renovating our commercial kitchen facilities, purchasing new equipment and vehicles, expanding our staff, and developing new service capabilities. Mom, Jessica had said during one of our planning meetings in 2017, I think we need to invest significantly in upgrading our facilities and equipment if we want to maintain our competitive advantage. The catering industry is evolving rapidly, and we need to stay ahead of the curve. Jessica's recommendations had been comprehensive and expensive, requiring investments totaling approximately $800,000 over 3 years. The improvements had included new commercial ovens and refrigeration systems, renovated food preparation areas, additional delivery vehicles, expanded inventory storage, and technology upgrades that had modernized our booking and client management systems. I'd authorized these investments based on Jessica's detailed business case presentations and her projections about increased capacity and improved efficiency. The improvements had indeed resulted in operational benefits that had supported our continued growth and had enhanced our ability to serve larger events and more demanding clients. The new equipment has really improved our capabilities, Thomas Mitchell had observed after the kitchen renovations had been completed. We can handle larger events more efficiently, and the food quality has improved because of the better preparation facilities. The investments had also been necessary for maintaining our reputation as Portland's premier catering company. Our competitors had been modernizing their operations, and we'd needed to make corresponding improvements to avoid losing market share to companies with more sophisticated facilities and capabilities. But what I'd later discovered was that Jessica had systematically inflated the costs of these improvements, creating fictional expenses that had allowed her to divert substantial amounts of the investment funding to personal accounts. The $800,000 in authorized improvements had actually cost approximately $520,000, with Jessica keeping the $280,000 difference while maintaining the appearance of responsible business investment. The equipment purchases had been made through vendors that Jessica had selected, companies that had provided kickbacks and rebates that she'd kept rather than crediting to Sinclair Catering's accounts. The renovation work had been performed by contractors who'd been instructed to inflate their invoices, with the excess payments being split between the contractors and Jessica. One of the most significant developments during this golden period had been my decision to include Jessica and Robert more extensively in my estate planning and financial management decisions. These discussions had seemed like responsible preparation for eventual succession and had reflected my confidence in their integrity and judgment. Mom, Jessica had said during one of our conversations about long-term planning, Robert and I think it would be helpful if we understood more about your overall financial situation and your plans for the eventual transfer of business ownership. We want to make sure we're prepared to handle these responsibilities properly. The conversations had led to comprehensive discussions about my investment portfolio, retirement accounts, insurance policies, real estate holdings, and business ownership structure. I'd shared detailed information about assets totaling approximately $12 million, including my 85% ownership stake in Sinclair Catering, investment accounts worth $4.2 million, and real estate valued at $2.8 million. We want to make sure all your assets are properly managed and protected, Robert had said during one of these planning sessions. There are tax optimization strategies and asset protection measures that could significantly benefit your long-term financial security. Robert's suggestions had seemed sophisticated and professional, and I'd implemented several of his recommendations for reorganizing my investment portfolio and establishing trusts and other legal structures that had been designed to minimize tax liabilities and ensure efficient asset transfer to future generations. The estate planning process had also involved updating my will, establishing powers of attorney for financial and medical decisions, and creating detailed instructions about my preferences for end-of-life care and asset distribution. Jessica and Robert had been designated as my primary agents for both financial and medical decision-making, authority that had seemed appropriate given their involvement in my business and their apparent concern for my welfare. We're honored that you trust us with these responsibilities, Jessica had said when I'd explained the power of attorney arrangements. We promise to always act in your best interests and to make decisions that reflect your values and preferences. The estate planning documents had been prepared by a respected attorney who'd specialized in business succession and wealth transfer, and the legal structure had been designed to ensure efficient operation of my business and proper management of my assets in the event of incapacity or death. But what I'd failed to recognize was that these estate planning discussions had provided Jessica and Robert with comprehensive intelligence about my assets and had given them legal authority that they would later use to facilitate their theft. The power of attorney documents that had been designed to protect my interests had become tools for financial abuse. Throughout this golden period, I'd maintained complete financial transparency with Jessica and Robert, sharing information about my accounts, investments, and business operations that had seemed appropriate for family members who would eventually inherit significant assets and business responsibilities. I want you to understand every aspect of my financial situation. I'd told Jessica during one of our regular financial planning meetings. Transparency is essential for proper succession planning, and I don't want there to be any surprises or confusion about my assets or business operations. This transparency had included providing access to account statements, investment reports, business financial records, and tax documents that had given Jessica and Robert detailed knowledge about every aspect of my financial life. I'd believed that this information sharing was necessary for preparing them to eventually manage my assets and continue operating Sinclair Catering successfully. Jessica had been particularly interested in understanding the details of my investment, accounts and business cash flow, asking detailed questions about income sources, expense patterns, and asset management strategies that had seemed motivated by responsible preparation for future financial responsibilities. I want to make sure I understand how you've structured your investments and why you've made specific asset allocation decisions, Jessica had said. If I'm going to be responsible for managing these accounts eventually, I need to understand your investment philosophy and risk tolerance. Robert had also participated in these financial discussions, contributing insights about tax planning, investment diversification, and business valuation that had seemed valuable and professional. His background in marketing and business development had provided perspectives about asset management and wealth preservation that had enhanced our planning discussions. Robert really understands the financial aspects of business ownership, I'd mentioned to my financial advisor during one of our planning meetings. His suggestions about tax optimization and asset protection have been very helpful. The financial transparency had also extended to business operations, with Jessica and Robert being given access to client contracts, vendor agreements, employee records, and operational procedures that had provided comprehensive understanding of how Sinclair Catering generated revenue and managed expenses. But this transparency had actually provided Jessica and Robert with the detailed knowledge they'd needed to systematically steal from my accounts while concealing their theft through sophisticated forgery and document manipulation. The trust-based information sharing that had seemed like responsible family planning had actually been providing intelligence for criminal activity. By 2019, my trust in Jessica and Robert had reached its absolute peak, based on years of apparent success, family harmony, and business collaboration that had seemed to validate every positive assumption I'd made about their character and capabilities. I'd been confident that our family business would continue thriving under their leadership, and that my financial security was ensured through their competent management and genuine concern for my welfare. I feel so fortunate to have Jessica and Robert as partners in both business and family life, I'd told Thomas Mitchell during one of our annual performance reviews. They've proven themselves to be intelligent, responsible, and completely trustworthy. I couldn't ask for better successors. This trust had led to my authorization of their increasing involvement in all aspects of my business and personal financial management. Jessica had been given signature authority on most business accounts, while Robert had been included in strategic planning meetings and investment decisions that had previously been limited to my closest advisors. The trust had also extended to my social and professional relationships, with Jessica and Robert representing Sinclair Catering at industry events, and serving as my primary contacts with clients, vendors, and business associates. Their performance in these roles had been excellent, and they'd enhanced our company's reputation through their professionalism and competence. Jessica and Robert are wonderful representatives of your company, one of our long-term clients had told me. They really understand your values and standards, and they've maintained the excellent service quality that made us choose Sinclair Catering originally. But this peak of trust and investment had actually represented the period when Jessica and Robert's theft had been most extensive and sophisticated. The authority and access I'd granted them based on proven performance had enabled them to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars while maintaining the appearance of successful business management and devoted family care. The golden era that had seemed like the culmination of everything I'd worked to achieve had actually been the period when everything I'd built was being systematically stolen by the people I'd trusted most completely. The success I'd been celebrating had been built on my own stolen money, and the family harmony I'd been enjoying had been a performance designed to facilitate fraud. Sitting in that roadside motel room, understanding that the golden years had been nothing but an elaborate theft scheme, I'd realized that Jessica and Robert had been playing a long game that had required years of careful planning and flawless performance. They'd studied me, manipulated me, and positioned themselves to steal everything I'd built while making me grateful for their apparent devotion and competence. But what they'd failed to understand was that the business skills and intelligence that had built Sinclair Catering were still intact, and that discovering their betrayal would unleash a response that would destroy everything they'd worked to steal. The golden era they'd engineered as the foundation for their theft was about to become the platform for their complete destruction. The 70-year-old woman they'd relegated to a roadside motel was about to demonstrate exactly why underestimating someone with nothing left to lose was the biggest mistake they'd ever made in their lives. Saturday morning in that roadside motel, I woke up with complete clarity about what needed to happen next. The 6 phone calls from the night before had provided me with enough evidence to destroy Jessica and Robert's lives, but I wanted more than just justice. I wanted total victory. The wedding they'd planned as my final humiliation was about to become their complete destruction, and I was going to ensure that every guest witnessed their downfall. The first call I made was to Patricia Wong, my business manager, instructing her to implement the emergency financial protocols we'd established years earlier for protecting company assets during crisis situations. "Patricia," I said, "I need you to freeze all accounts that Jessica has access to, cancel her signature authority, and transfer all liquid assets to the secure accounts that only you and I can access. Do it immediately, before the banks open. For regular business. Margaret, that's going to lock Jessica out of managing daily operations," Patricia had warned. "Are you sure you want to take such drastic action?" "Patricia, Jessica has been stealing from me for years. The evidence is overwhelming, and I need to protect what's left of my assets before she can steal anything else. Implement the lockdown. Protocols now." Within 2 hours, Jessica's access to Sinclair Catering's accounts had been completely severed. The emergency protocols had been designed to protect our business assets in the event of embezzlement or fraud, and they'd worked exactly as intended. Jessica would discover the lockdown when she tried to make payments for wedding expenses, at which point she'd realize that her theft had been discovered. The second call was to Michael Chen, my attorney, instructing him to immediately file for emergency injunctions that would freeze Jessica and Robert's personal assets and prevent them from liquidating anything before civil and criminal proceedings could be initiated. "Michael, I want restraining orders on their house, their cars, their investment accounts, everything. I don't want them to be able to sell so much as a piece of jewelry before we've recovered every dollar they've stolen." Margaret, emergency. Asset freezing requires substantial evidence of fraud. Do you have documentation that supports these allegations? Michael, I have forensic accounting reports showing $340,000 in unauthorized transactions, forged medical documents claiming I'm mentally incompetent, and evidence that they've been positioning themselves to steal my entire estate. File the papers immediately. By Saturday afternoon, legal papers had been filed that would freeze Jessica and Robert's assets pending the outcome of fraud investigations. The injunctions had been granted based on the evidence Patricia and David Kim had provided, and sheriff's deputies would be serving the papers that evening during the wedding rehearsal dinner. The third call had been to Detective Maria Santos at Portland Police, providing her with the complete evidence package that documented Jessica and Robert's systematic theft and fraud scheme. Detective Santos, I have documentation of financial elder abuse involving forged medical documents, identity theft, and embezzlement totaling over $300,000. The perpetrators are my daughter and son-in-law, and they're currently hosting a wedding celebration that's being funded with stolen money. Mrs. Sinclair, these are serious allegations. Do you have evidence that would support criminal charges? Detective Santos, I have forensic accounting reports, handwriting analysis of forged documents, and testimony from multiple witnesses who were told fabricated stories about my mental health. I want them arrested during their daughter's wedding reception. Detective Santos had been initially hesitant about making arrests during a wedding celebration, but the evidence had been compelling, enough to justify immediate action. Warrants had been issued for Jessica and Robert's arrest on charges of elder abuse, fraud, theft, forgery, and conspiracy, with additional federal charges being prepared for wire fraud and identity theft. Mrs. Sinclair will coordinate the arrests to minimize disruption to innocent family members, but your daughter and son-in-law will be taken into custody before the evening is over. The timing had been perfect. Jessica and Robert would be arrested in front of 150 guests who'd been told I was suffering from dementia, providing dramatic evidence that the confused elderly woman they'd been pitying was actually the victim of systematic theft by her own family members. The fourth call had been to Helen Rodriguez, my longtime friend who was attending the wedding and staying at the Four Seasons with the other honored guests. Helen, I need you to do something very important for me. I want you to gather our mutual friends at the wedding and explain what's really been happening. Jessica and Robert have been stealing from me while telling everyone I'm suffering from cognitive decline. Tonight, everyone is going to learn the truth. Margaret, are you certain about these allegations? This seems incredibly serious. Helen, I have documentation proving everything. By the end of tonight, Jessica and Robert will be in jail, and everyone at that wedding will understand that the mentally incompetent woman they've been pitying actually discovered their fraud and destroyed their lives. Helen had agreed to discreetly inform our friends about the real situation, preparing them for the dramatic revelations that would unfold during the evening's events. By the time the arrests occurred, the wedding guests would understand exactly what they were witnessing. The fifth call had been to the Four Seasons Portland, where I'd implemented the most satisfying aspect of my revenge plan. Using my decades of experience in the hospitality industry and my extensive connections with hotel management, I'd arranged to purchase every room reservation that Jessica and Robert had made for their wedding guests. This is Margaret Sinclair from Sinclair Catering, I'd said to the hotel general manager, someone I'd worked with on numerous events over the years. I understand that Jessica Crawford has a block of rooms reserved for this weekend's wedding celebration. I'd like to purchase all those reservations. Mrs. Sinclair, I'm not sure I understand. Are you wanting to transfer the reservations or add additional rooms to the block? I want to purchase the reservations outright, paying full rates for all. The rooms, then reassign them according to my own preferences. Jessica Crawford will no longer be financially responsible for any of the accommodations. The hotel had been initially confused by my request, but my long-standing relationship with their management and my offer to pay premium rates for all the rooms had made the transaction straightforward. Within an hour, I'd become the owner of all the wedding accommodation reservations, paying approximately $85,000 for rooms that Jessica had originally booked for $31,000. The reassignments had been strategic and satisfying. Caroline and her new husband James would keep their honeymoon suite. They were innocent victims of their parents' fraud and deserved to enjoy their wedding night without additional trauma. The legitimate guests who'd been honest about my mental state would keep their reservations as planned, but Jessica and Robert's families, friends, and business associates who'd been told I was suffering from dementia would find themselves reassigned to accommodations that matched their opinion of my mental capacity. The relatives who'd been staying in luxury suites would be moved to budget motels. The business colleagues who'd been told I was incompetent would find themselves at roadside, inns similar to where Jessica had relegated me. I want them to experience exactly the kind of accommodations they thought were appropriate for someone they considered mentally incompetent, I'd explained to the hotel manager. They'll understand the irony when they're arrested for fraud. The sixth call had been directly to Jessica, informing her that her theft had been discovered and that her arrest was imminent. I'd wanted her to spend the day of her daughter's wedding knowing that her life was about to be destroyed, just as she'd wanted me to spend the weekend humiliated and powerless. Jessica, this is your mother. I'm calling to let you know that I've discovered your fraud scheme, frozen all the accounts you've been stealing from, and arranged for your arrest during Caroline's wedding reception. The silence that had followed had been profound. Jessica had clearly been unprepared for the possibility that I would discover her theft, much less respond so quickly and comprehensively. Mom, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but Jessica, I have forensic accounting reports documenting $340,000 in theft, handwriting analysis proving you forged medical documents, and testimony from multiple witnesses about the lies you've told regarding my mental health. You and Robert will be arrested tonight in front of everyone who believed your stories about my cognitive decline. Mom, you're confused. We've been trying to help you manage your finances because, Jessica, I am 70 years old, not brain. Dead. I built an $8 million company from nothing, and I have enough intelligence left to recognize theft when I see it. You made the mistake of underestimating exactly how capable I still am. The conversation had ended with Jessica frantically trying to explain away the evidence, but her panic had been obvious. She'd realized that her carefully constructed fraud scheme had been completely exposed, and that the consequences would be devastating. Saturday afternoon had been spent preparing for the evening's confrontation, coordinating with law enforcement, attorneys, and the media contacts who would document Jessica and Robert's downfall. I'd wanted their arrest to be as public and humiliating as possible, ensuring that everyone who'd believed their lies about my mental incompetence would witness their criminal behavior. Detective Santos had coordinated with hotel security and wedding venue management to ensure that the arrests would be conducted efficiently while minimizing trauma for Caroline and the innocent guests. The plan had been to wait until after the wedding ceremony but before the reception dinner, allowing Caroline to have her wedding moment, while ensuring that Jessica and Robert faced justice in front of the people they'd deceived. I'd also contacted Portland's major media outlets, providing them with copies of the fraud evidence and alerting them to the dramatic arrests that would occur during one of the city's most high-profile social events. The story of a prominent business family's fraud scheme being exposed during their daughter's wedding had been irresistible to local news organizations. This is going to be front-page news, the Oregonian reporter had said after reviewing the evidence I'd provided. A respected catering company executive stealing from her elderly mother while claiming the mother has dementia? And the arrests happening during a wedding? This is an incredible story. The media coverage had been crucial for ensuring that Jessica and Robert's professional and social reputations would be completely destroyed. The story would reach clients, colleagues, and business associates throughout the Pacific Northwest, guaranteeing that their careers in Portland would be permanently ended. Saturday evening, I'd arrived at the historic Columbia River Gorge Hotel, wearing an elegant black dress and carrying myself with the dignity and confidence of someone who'd just destroyed her enemies completely. The contrast with the confused, helpless elderly woman Jessica had portrayed had been stark and deliberate. The wedding ceremony had been beautiful, with Caroline looking radiant and James appearing genuinely happy to be marrying into what he'd believed was a successful, harmonious family. I'd felt genuine sadness for Caroline, knowing that her perfect wedding day would be forever associated with her parents' arrest and the revelation of their criminal behavior. "Grandma Maggie!" Caroline had exclaimed when she'd seen me, rushing over with obvious relief and joy. "I'm so glad you're here. Mom said you were having a difficult time and might not be able to attend." "Caroline, sweetheart, I wouldn't miss your wedding for anything. You look absolutely beautiful, and I'm so happy for you and James." The conversation had been bittersweet, knowing that within hours Caroline would learn that her parents were criminals, and that her grandmother was not the confused elderly woman she'd been told to pity. The wedding she'd planned as the celebration of her new life would become the moment when her family's lies were exposed. Jessica and Robert had been visibly tense throughout the ceremony, clearly aware that their arrest was imminent, but unable to leave without creating suspicions that would have made their situation worse. They'd been trapped by their own wedding planning, forced to participate in a celebration while knowing their lives were about to be destroyed. "Margaret," Robert had approached me after the ceremony, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding about the hotel arrangements. Jessica tried to make some payments this morning and had trouble accessing the accounts." "Robert, there's no misunderstanding. I've frozen all accounts that Jessica had access to because I've discovered her theft. The hotel reservations have also been reassigned to reflect my preferences rather than hers." Robert's face had gone pale as he'd realized the scope of my response to their fraud. The systematic theft they'd planned as my gradual destruction had been turned into their immediate devastation. The arrests had occurred exactly as planned during the cocktail hour before the reception dinner, in full view of the 150 guests who'd been told I was suffering from cognitive decline. Detective Santos and 4 other officers had entered the reception area with warrants for Jessica and Robert's arrest on multiple felony charges. "Jessica Crawford and Robert Crawford, you're under arrest for elder abuse, fraud, theft, forgery, and conspiracy," Detective Santos had announced in a voice that carried throughout the reception area. "You have the right to remain silent." The reaction from the wedding guests had been immediate and dramatic. The business leaders, social elite, and family friends who'd been told I was mentally incompetent had watched in shock as my daughter and son-in-law were handcuffed and led away by police officers. "Ladies and gentlemen," I'd announced to the stunned wedding guests, "I want you to understand what you've just witnessed. For 3 years, Jessica and Robert have been stealing from me while telling you that I was suffering from dementia and needed family management of my affairs. The evidence of their fraud has been provided to law enforcement, and they will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." The silence that had followed had been profound. The respected business couple who'd been praised for their devoted care of a confused elderly relative had been revealed as criminals who'd been systematically stealing from their victim while destroying her reputation. The confused elderly woman you've been pitying for months actually discovered their fraud, documented their crimes, and arranged for their arrest during the event they planned as my final humiliation, I'd continued. "I am 70 years old, not mentally incompetent, and I am perfectly capable of protecting myself from people who try to steal from me." Helen Rodriguez had been the first to respond, approaching me with obvious emotion and remorse. "Margaret, I am so sorry. We believed Jessica's stories about your health problems, and we thought we were being supportive by accepting their explanations for your behavior. We should have talked to you directly instead of accepting secondhand reports about your condition." The apologies had continued throughout the evening as guests had realized the scope of Jessica and Robert's deception and their own roles in enabling the fraud through their willingness to believe lies about my mental capacity. The social and business leaders who'd been deceived had been horrified to discover that they'd been manipulated into supporting elder abuse. Over the following week, the full scope of my financial counterattack had become apparent as Jessica and Robert had discovered that every aspect of their comfortable lifestyle had been built on stolen money that was now being recovered through civil litigation and criminal restitution orders. The luxury home in the Pearl District had been subject to asset forfeiture proceedings, with liens filed against the property for the full amount of documented theft plus penalties and interest. The house they'd purchased with my stolen money would be sold to pay restitution, leaving them without their primary residence. Their investment accounts, retirement savings, and business assets had been frozen pending the outcome of criminal proceedings, ensuring that they couldn't liquidate anything to fund legal defense or maintain their lifestyle during the prosecution process. The European vacations, luxury cars, private school tuition, and designer clothing that had been funded through theft would all be subject to recovery actions, with forensic accountants documenting every expense that could be traced to stolen funds. "Mrs. Sinclair," my attorney Michael Chen had reported, "we've identified assets worth approximately $1.2 million that were purchased with stolen funds. The recovery process will take time, but you should expect to recover your losses plus substantial additional damages." The financial destruction had been comprehensive and permanent. Even if Jessica and Robert eventually avoided prison time, they would spend years paying restitution and would never again have access to the kind of wealth that had supported their fraudulent lifestyle. The criminal charges had been filed in multiple jurisdictions, reflecting the sophisticated nature of Jessica and Robert's fraud scheme and the various laws they'd violated during their theft operation. State charges had included elder abuse, theft, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, with potential sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years in prison, depending on the specific charges and the defendant's criminal history. Federal charges had been added for wire fraud, identity theft, and postal fraud related to their use of electronic communications and mail systems to facilitate their crimes. The federal charges had carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in prison, and had ensured that Jessica and Robert would face serious consequences regardless of the outcomes in state court. The evidence in this case is overwhelming. The district attorney had announced during a press conference about the arrests. The defendants systematically stole from an elderly family member while creating elaborate lies about her mental capacity to justify their control of her assets. This represents elder abuse at its most calculating and cruel. The media coverage had been extensive and devastating for Jessica and Robert's reputations. Portland's business community had been shocked by the revelation that a respected event planning executive and her marketing professional husband had been stealing from the elderly woman who'd built the company they'd helped manage. Jessica Crawford was considered one of Portland's rising business stars, the Business Journal had reported. The revelation that her success was built on theft from her mother has sent shockwaves through the event planning industry and raised questions about financial oversight in family businesses. The civil litigation had proceeded even more quickly than the criminal prosecution, with Jessica and Robert's attorneys advising them to settle rather than face the possibility of massive punitive damages at trial. The settlement had included full restitution of documented theft, punitive damages equal to 3 times the stolen amount, payment of all legal and investigative costs, and permanent restraining orders prohibiting any contact with me or interference with my business operations. "Mrs. Sinclair," my attorney had explained, "the total settlement amount is $1.8 million, which represents not just recovery of your losses, but substantial punishment for the defendant's criminal behavior. They'll be paying you money for years to come." The settlement had also included provisions requiring Jessica and Robert to publicly acknowledge their fraud, apologize for their crimes, and cooperate with any future investigations into their financial activities. The public acknowledgement had been particularly satisfying, forcing them to admit their lies about my mental capacity. "We acknowledge that Margaret Sinclair is and has always been mentally competent," their public statement had read. "Our claims about her cognitive decline were false and were made to facilitate our theft of her assets. We apologize for our criminal behavior and accept full responsibility for our actions." The exposure of Jessica and Robert's fraud had initially created challenges for Sinclair Catering, with some clients expressing concerns about the company's stability and management structure. However, the revelation that I had discovered and stopped. The fraud had ultimately enhanced our reputation for integrity and competent leadership. Mrs. Sinclair's response to her family's betrayal demonstrates exactly the kind of intelligence and determination that built Sinclair Catering, one of our long-term clients had written in a testimonial. Her ability to identify and stop fraud shows that the company remains under capable management. Thomas Mitchell had stepped up to assume greater operational responsibilities during the transition period, working with Patricia Wong to ensure continuity of services while I'd focused on legal matters and business restructuring. Margaret, this crisis has actually demonstrated the strength of the systems and team you've built, Thomas had observed. The company's operations continued smoothly even during the fraud investigation, which shows that Sinclair Catering is much more than any individual person. The business had also benefited from the media attention surrounding the fraud case, with several new clients contacting us specifically because they'd been impressed by my response to the crisis and wanted to work with a company that was led by someone with proven integrity and competence. We chose Sinclair Catering specifically because of how Mrs. Sinclair handled her family's betrayal, one new client had explained. Anyone who can discover and stop sophisticated fraud while protecting her business interests is exactly the kind of person we want managing our events. The social consequences for Jessica and Robert had been as devastating as the legal and financial penalties. Their arrests during Caroline's wedding had been witnessed by Portland's social and business elite, ensuring that their reputations were permanently destroyed throughout the community where they'd built their careers. The friends who'd believed their lies about my mental decline had been horrified to discover that they'd been manipulated into supporting elder abuse, and many had contacted me to apologize for their role in enabling Jessica and Robert's fraud. Margaret, I am deeply ashamed that I believed Jessica's stories about your cognitive problems without talking to you directly, one family friend had written. Your intelligence and competence were always obvious to anyone who actually spent time with you. I should have questioned why we were only hearing secondhand reports about your condition. The business community's response had been equally satisfying, with Jessica's professional reputation being completely destroyed by the revelation of her criminal behavior. The event planning executive who'd been celebrated as a rising star had become a cautionary tale about the importance of ethical business practices. Jessica Crawford's fraud conviction should remind all business professionals that success achieved through criminal means will ultimately result in total destruction, an industry publication had editorialized. Her case demonstrates that theft and deception may provide temporary advantages, but they inevitably lead to permanent consequences. Robert's marketing career had been similarly destroyed, with his employer terminating his position immediately after his arrest and his professional licenses being revoked pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. The most challenging aspect of the aftermath had been rebuilding my relationship with Caroline, who'd been devastated to learn that her parents were criminals and that her grandmother was not the confused elderly woman she'd been taught to pity. Grandma Maggie, I'm so sorry, Caroline had said during our first conversation after her parents' arrest. I believed Mom's stories about your memory problems, and I treated you like you were incapable of understanding what was happening. I should have talked to you directly instead of accepting what I was told. The conversation had been emotional, for both of us, but it had also been the beginning of a stronger relationship based on honesty, rather than the lies that Jessica and Robert had used to manipulate our family dynamics. Caroline, you were manipulated by people who should have been protecting you instead of using you as part of their fraud scheme, I'd explained. None of this is your fault, and I don't want you to feel guilty about believing your parents. Over the following months, Caroline and James had gradually distanced themselves from Jessica and Robert, recognizing that their parents' criminal behavior had made continued close relationships impossible. Caroline had also expressed interest in eventually joining Sinclair Catering, wanting to rebuild the family business relationships that her parents' fraud had damaged. "I want to learn the business from you directly," Caroline had said, "not from people who were stealing from you while pretending to care about your welfare. I want to understand what you really built and how to maintain the integrity that made Sinclair Catering successful." The criminal prosecution had concluded with plea agreements that had sent both Jessica and Robert to prison, ensuring that they faced serious consequences for their systematic theft and fraud. Jessica had been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, with requirements for full restitution and community service focused on elder abuse prevention. Her sentence had reflected the sophisticated nature of her fraud scheme and her leadership role in planning and executing the theft. Robert had received a slightly shorter sentence of 3 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of probation, acknowledging his supporting rather than leadership role in the fraud conspiracy. However, his sentence had also included substantial financial penalties and permanent prohibition from working in any fiduciary capacity. The defendant's crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of family trust and social responsibility, the federal judge had said during sentencing. Elder abuse is particularly heinous because it targets vulnerable individuals who should be able to depend on family members for protection rather than exploitation. The sentences had provided satisfying closure to the legal proceedings, ensuring that Jessica and Robert would spend years in prison reflecting on the consequences of their betrayal. Their crimes had also been documented in permanent criminal records that would affect their employment opportunities and social standing for the rest of their lives. 2 years after that roadside motel night, when I'd discovered Jessica and Robert's fraud, I was living a life that was more fulfilling and secure than I'd ever imagined possible. The betrayal that had been intended to destroy me had actually revealed strengths and capabilities that I'd forgotten I possessed. Sinclair Catering had not only recovered from the crisis, but had grown stronger, with annual revenues exceeding $10 million and a reputation for integrity that had attracted new clients throughout the Pacific Northwest. The company's success had been enhanced rather than damaged by the revelation that I'd discovered and stopped fraud, demonstrating competent leadership and financial oversight. Mrs. Sinclair has proven that age and experience are advantages rather than limitations, a business profile had stated. Her response to family fraud demonstrated exactly the kind of intelligence and determination that built her company and that continues to drive its success. My personal life had also been transformed in positive ways, with new friendships and social connections that were based on mutual respect rather than family obligation or business relationships. The crisis had eliminated relationships that had been built on deception while strengthening connections with people who valued integrity and honesty. The financial recovery had exceeded my expectations, with restitution payments, civil damages, and continued business success providing more wealth and security than I'd had before Jessica's theft. The assets that had been stolen were being returned with interest and penalties that had actually increased my net worth. Most importantly, the experience had provided profound personal satisfaction and empowerment, proving that age didn't mean helplessness and that intelligence and determination could overcome even the most sophisticated betrayal. I'm often asked how I found the strength to fight back against my own daughter, I'd said during a speech to a senior citizens group about elder abuse prevention. The answer is that the strength was always there. I just had to remember that being 70 years old means having 70 years of experience dealing with challenges and solving problems. The story of Jessica and Robert's fraud and my response had become a case study used by law enforcement, legal professionals, and elder advocacy organizations to educate people about financial abuse prevention and response strategies. Mrs. Sinclair's case demonstrates that elder abuse can be successfully identified and stopped, but only if victims have the courage to fight back and the resources to pursue justice. Detective Santos had explained during a training seminar for fraud investigators. Her response shows that age is not a barrier to effective self-protection. The case had also inspired other elderly victims of financial abuse to come forward and seek help, with several successful prosecutions being initiated based on evidence and strategies developed during my legal proceedings. Margaret Sinclair's victory has encouraged other seniors to recognize that they don't have to accept financial abuse as inevitable, an elder law attorney had observed. Her case proves that fighting back is possible and that justice can be achieved. But beyond the legal and social impact, my story had become a personal testament to the power of refusing to accept victimization and the importance of maintaining independence and dignity regardless of age or circumstances. If someone in your life is treating you like you're disposable, remember my story, I'd concluded in interviews about the case. Remember that respect isn't optional, that trust once broken cannot be rebuilt, and that people who underestimate you based on your age might be making the most expensive mistake of their lives. You're never too old, never too trusting, never too dependent on family relationships to fight for what's rightfully yours. Sometimes the best thing that can happen is when someone pushes you far enough that you finally discover exactly how strong you really are. The roadside motel that Jessica had intended as my final humiliation had become the launching point for the most empowering chapter of my life. The daughter who'd thought she could steal my empire had actually helped me discover that I was much more powerful than either of us had ever imagined. That's a lesson she'll have plenty of time to think about during her 4 years in federal prison. And for the rest of her life, every time she considers taking advantage of someone she thinks is vulnerable, she'll remember the 70-year-old woman who taught her that some people fight back harder than you ever expected. Justice served. Chakti learned. Power reclaimed. Sometimes the best revenge is simply showing people exactly who they were foolish enough to cross. The family who thought a roadside motel was good enough for their 70-year-old matriarch learned that some people refused to be discarded, and that underestimating a woman who built an empire from nothing was the biggest mistake they'd ever make in their lives. What's your story? Have you ever had to fight back against family members who thought that Jessica and Robert thought they were stealing my legacy? What they actually did was help me create a new one, as the woman who proved that family betrayal is no match for intelligence, determination, and an absolute refusal to be defeated. That's a legacy worth fighting for, and that's a lesson worth sharing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.